The evening sun painted the sky orange and pink as expensive cars rolled through the iron gates of Thornwood Manor. This wasn't just any house. It was the kind of place you see in movies, with stone walls that seemed to touch the clouds and windows that sparkled like diamonds. Tonight was special. Mrs. Eleanor Thornwood was throwing her biggest party of the year, and everyone who was anyone had received an invitation. Inside the manor, the main ballroom looked like something out of a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, throwing rainbow colors across the marble floors. Tables were covered with white silk cloths, and each one had flowers that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Waiters in crisp black suits moved quietly between guests, carrying trays of champagne and tiny foods that looked too pretty to eat. But this story isn't about the rich guests in their designer dresses and expensive watches. This story is about two people working behind the scenes. Maria Santos had been cleaning rooms and polishing silverware at Thornwood Manor for 15 years. Her hands were rough from work and her uniform was simple and plain. But her smile was genuine, and everyone who worked at the manor respected her. She was the kind of person who remembered your birthday and asked about your family. Tonight, Maria had brought her son with her. Lucas was 17, tall and thin with quiet eyes that seemed to notice everything. He wasn't supposed to be in the main areas where guests were gathering, but he needed to help his mother. Money was tight at home, and any extra work meant they could pay the bills without stress. Lucas had helped set up chairs earlier, carried boxes, and now he was supposed to stay in the back hallways where the staff moved around unseen. But Lucas couldn't help himself. He found a spot near one of the side doors where he could peek into the ballroom without being noticed. His eyes weren't on the fancy dresses or the important-looking people. He was staring at something else entirely. Right in the center of the ballroom, sitting on a raised platform like a king on a throne, was a grand piano. It was black and shiny, so polished that Lucas could see the chandelier reflected in its surface. To most people in that room, the piano was just decoration, something pretty to look at. But to Lucas, it was everything. He had loved piano music for as long as he could remember. When he was little, his mother used to clean a music school, and he would listen to students practice through the walls. The sounds made him feel things he couldn't explain, happy and sad at the same time, like flying and falling all at once. His mother had noticed his interest. 3 years ago, on his 14th birthday, she gave him a present that made him cry. It was a small electronic keyboard, the cheapest one she could find. Maria had saved for 8 months, putting away a few dollars whenever she could. The keyboard only had 61 keys instead of the 88 on a real piano. Some of the keys stuck and the sound wasn't perfect, but to Lucas it was treasure. From that day on, Lucas taught himself to play. He couldn't afford lessons, so he watched free videos on his mother's old phone. He borrowed books from the library, studying them until the pages were worn. Every night after finishing his homework, he practiced on that little keyboard, wearing headphones so he wouldn't disturb the neighbors in their small apartment. His fingers learned to move across the keys, slowly at first, then faster, finding the music that lived somewhere inside him. Now, standing in that hallway and looking at the real grand piano in the ballroom, Lucas felt his heart beat faster. He had never touched a real piano like that. Never felt the weight of proper keys under his fingers or heard the rich, full sound that only a real piano could make. His keyboard at home was like looking at a picture of the ocean. This piano in front of him was the ocean itself, deep and powerful and real. Maria found him standing there, lost in thought. She touched his shoulder gently. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered. "We need to stay in the back. This isn't our world tonight." Her voice was kind but firm. She knew how her son felt about music, but she also knew the rules. People like them didn't belong in rooms like this, not as guests anyway. Lucas nodded and followed his mother back toward the kitchen area. But he looked over his shoulder one more time at that beautiful piano, not knowing that in just a few hours everything in his life was about to change, not knowing that the thing he wanted most in the world was about to become the thing that would change his future forever. The guests kept arriving, their laughter getting louder as they drank champagne and told stories about their vacation homes and business deals. Nobody noticed the teenage boy in the hallway with worn sneakers and secondhand clothes. Nobody knew that he could hear the difference between a C-sharp and a C natural just by listening. Nobody suspected that behind his quiet face was a gift that had been growing for years, waiting for its moment to be seen. The ballroom was filling up now. Mrs. Thornwood herself was greeting guests at the entrance, her silver dress catching the light every time she moved. She was talking about the evening's entertainment, building excitement for what was coming next. A famous pianist was going to play for them, someone whose name appeared on concert posters and whose albums won awards. The guests whispered to each other, feeling special to be there. Lucas heard the whispers even from the hallway. His heart sank a little. He would have given anything to hear a real professional play on that piano, but he knew he couldn't stay and watch. He had work to do, helping clear plates and refill water glasses. That was his job. That was his place. He didn't know yet that sometimes your place isn't where people tell you it is. Sometimes your place is where your courage takes you. And tonight, Lucas was going to need more courage than he ever had before. Victor had finished his performance and stepped away from the piano to mingle with the guests. The instrument sat there on its platform, silent now but somehow still commanding attention. To Lucas it seemed to be calling to him, just a few steps away, so close he could almost feel the smooth keys under his fingers. He didn't plan what happened next. His feet just started moving before his brain could tell them to stop. One step, then another. The crowd was busy talking, drinking, laughing at jokes that probably weren't that funny. Nobody was paying attention to a teenager in plain clothes moving quietly toward the piano. Lucas reached the platform and stood there for a moment, his heart hammering so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it. The piano was even more beautiful up close. He could see his own reflection in the polished black surface. He looked small and out of place, but his eyes were bright with something that might have been hope or might have been foolishness. Slowly, carefully, Lucas reached out and touched one key. Just one. The note rang out clear and pure, and to him it was the most beautiful sound in the world. He pressed another key, then another, starting to pick out a simple melody. That's when someone noticed him. Oh my God, look! A young woman's voice cut through the conversation like a knife. Her name was Brittany Chen, daughter of a real estate developer, and she was the kind of person who found entertainment in other people's embarrassment. The help is touching the piano. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Suddenly, Lucas felt about 100 pairs of eyes land on him. His hand froze above the keys. The room went from warm to ice cold in an instant. "Is that the maid's son?" someone whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "What does he think he's doing?" another voice added, followed by a ripple of laughter. Lucas wanted to run. Every cell in his body was screaming at him to get away, to disappear, to go back to being invisible. But his feet wouldn't move. He was trapped there, frozen like a rabbit caught in headlights. Maria pushed through the crowd, her face pale with fear and embarrassment. "Lucas, come away from there right now," she said quietly, reaching for his arm. But Brittany wasn't done. She was enjoying this too much. "No, wait," she called out, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "Let him play. I bet he thinks he can do what Mr. Ashford does." She turned to her friends, her voice dripping with mockery. Maybe he learned from watching videos on his phone. The laughter got louder. People were pulling out their own phones now, ready to record what they clearly expected to be a disaster. This was entertainment to them, something they would tell their friends about later over expensive lunches. Victor Ashford had been standing near the bar, but now he walked over, drawn by the commotion. When he saw Lucas standing at his piano, something cold flashed in his eyes. This was his stage, his instrument, his moment. Who was this nobody trying to steal his spotlight? But Victor was too smart to show anger. Instead, he put on a smile that was somehow worse than any frown could have been. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "What do we have here? A young man who appreciates music. How charming." The way he said charming made it sound like an insult. Mrs. Thornwood looked horrified. This was her party, her event, and now it was turning into some kind of circus. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Ashford," she stammered. "Maria, please take your son and—" No, Victor interrupted, holding up his hand. He was looking at Lucas now, really looking at him, and his smile got wider and colder. "I insist. Let the young man play." He turned to address the crowd. "After all, we've just been discussing how piano requires proper training, proper breeding. Perhaps our young friend here can demonstrate for us exactly what I mean." The crowd tittered with anticipation. They understood what Victor was doing. He was going to let Lucas embarrass himself, prove his point about who belonged at a piano and who didn't. It would be a lesson, entertainment, and confirmation of their own superiority all rolled into one. Lucas looked at his mother. Maria's eyes were pleading with him to walk away, to save himself from the humiliation that was surely coming. But Lucas saw something else in her face too. Under the fear, there was something that looked almost like hope. Like maybe, just maybe, she believed in him. He looked back at Victor, at the smug expression on the older man's face, at Brittany and her friends' phones raised and ready, at Mrs. Thornwood embarrassed by his very presence, at all these people in their expensive clothes who had already decided he would fail before he played a single note. Something shifted inside Lucas. The fear was still there, but it was sharing space now with something else. Anger, yes, but more than that. Determination. Every hour he had spent practicing on his cheap keyboard, every video he had watched until he had it memorized, every book he had read in the library until closing time, all of it came flooding back. "Okay," Lucas heard himself say. His voice came out quieter than he wanted, but it was steady. "I'll play." The laughter got louder. Someone made a comment about knowing your place. Another person said something about kids these days thinking they're special. Victor gestured to the piano bench like he was granting a huge favor. "Please," Victor said. "Show us what you've learned from—" "Where did you learn exactly? YouTube?" More laughter. Lucas walked to the bench and sat down. The leather was soft, so different from the hard chair he used at home. The piano seemed huge from this angle, stretching out in front of him like an ocean. His worn sneakers looked ridiculous next to the polished wooden pedals. Everything about this moment screamed that he didn't belong. Maria had her hand over her mouth, tears already forming in her eyes. She knew how this looked to everyone else. She knew what they expected. But she also knew her son, knew the hours he had put in, the passion that drove him. She was terrified for him, but she was also proud. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, at least he had the courage to try. Lucas placed his hands on the keys, feeling their weight, their smoothness. They were nothing like the light plastic keys of his keyboard at home. These were real, solid, responsive. The piano was waiting, ready to either expose him as a fool or reveal what he had hidden inside him for so long. He took a deep breath. Behind him, someone giggled. A camera phone flashed. Victor stood off to the side, arms crossed, that knowing smile still on his face. Lucas closed his eyes for just a second. In that second, he wasn't in a fancy ballroom being mocked by rich people. He was back in his tiny room with his little keyboard, playing because he loved it, playing because music was the only thing that made sense when everything else was confusing and hard. He remembered his mother's face when she gave him that keyboard, remembered the sacrifice she had made. He opened his eyes and began to play. The murmur of conversation in the ballroom suddenly changed. People stopped mid-sentence and turned toward the entrance. He was here. Victor Ashford had arrived, and he made sure everyone knew it. Victor didn't just walk into a room. He made an entrance. He was about 45 years old, with silver streaks in his dark hair that made him look distinguished. His suit probably cost more than Maria's entire year's salary. He wore it like armor, like proof that he was better than everyone else, and maybe in his mind he was. The guests parted like water as Victor moved through them, shaking hands here, kissing cheeks there. He had a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Everything about him said, "I know I'm special, and I'm doing you a favor by being here." Mrs. Thornwood rushed over to greet him, practically glowing with excitement. Having Victor Ashford play at your party was like hanging a masterpiece painting on your wall. It showed the world you had arrived. Lucas watched from his hidden spot near the door. He had seen Victor's videos online, watched his concerts on his mother's phone screen. The man could play. There was no doubt about that. His fingers moved across the piano keys like they were dancing, hitting every note perfectly. Lucas had spent hours studying those videos, trying to learn from them, trying to understand how Victor made difficult pieces look so easy. But something about seeing Victor in person felt different. In videos, you only saw the music. Here, you saw the man. And the man seemed to love himself more than he loved the piano. Victor finally made his way to the piano, but not before taking a glass of champagne and drinking it slowly while people watched him. It was part of his show, making people wait, building anticipation. He sat down at the bench and adjusted it precisely, moving it back and forth until it was exactly where he wanted. He flexed his fingers, cracked his knuckles, and looked out at the crowd with that same cold smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Thornwood announced, her voice trembling with excitement, "I give you the magnificent Victor Ashford." The room erupted in applause before he had even played a single note. Victor soaked it in, nodding slowly like a king acknowledging his subjects. Then finally his hands came down on the keys. The sound that filled the ballroom was incredible. Victor was playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most beautiful and difficult pieces ever written. His fingers flew across the keys, hitting every note with precision. The music swelled and dipped, powerful one moment, gentle the next. It was like watching a master craftsman at work. Lucas felt his breath catch in his throat. This was what a real grand piano sounded like. This was what real training and years of practice could create. The music washed over him like waves, and for a moment he forgot where he was. He forgot about his cheap keyboard at home, forgot about his worn-out sneakers, forgot about everything except the sound. The piece lasted about 15 minutes, and when Victor hit the final chord, the silence that followed was almost as powerful as the music itself. Then the room exploded. People jumped to their feet, clapping and shouting. Some of the women had tears in their eyes. Mrs. Thornwood looked like she might faint from happiness. Victor stood and bowed, once, twice, 3 times. He was eating up the attention like a starving man at a feast. When the applause finally started to die down, he held up his hand for silence. The room quieted immediately, everyone eager to hear what he would say. "Thank you. Thank you," Victor said, his voice smooth and practiced. You know, playing for an audience that truly appreciates fine music is a rare gift. He paused, letting his words sink in.
Piano is not like other instruments.
It requires not just practice but breeding. Understanding it requires a certain kind of person raised in the right environment with the right education. Some people in the crowd nodded, agreeing with him. Lucas felt something uncomfortable twist in his stomach. Victor continued, warming to his subject. I started playing when I was 4 years old. My parents, both musicians themselves, recognized my talent immediately. I had the best teachers money could buy. I attended the finest music schools. This is what creates true artistry. Not everyone can do what I do. Not everyone should even try. The way he said it made it clear what he meant. Piano was for people like him. Rich people, educated people, people with the right last names and the right addresses. Everyone else should know their place and not waste time dreaming about things they couldn't have. Lucas felt his hands curl into fists. He knew Victor was talking about people like him without even knowing he existed. People who lived in small apartments and wore second-hand clothes and couldn't afford fancy music schools. People who were supposed to accept that some doors were closed to them forever. A few people in the crowd looked uncomfortable with Victor's words, but most just nodded and clapped some more. They liked hearing that they were special, that their money and status meant something more than just luck or circumstance. They liked being told they deserved their place at the top. Victor played 2 more pieces that evening, each one perfect and cold. Beautiful notes with no heart behind them, or so it seemed to Lucas. It was like watching someone show off expensive jewelry, impressive but somehow empty. During a break, Victor stood by the piano accepting compliments from a circle of admirers. He was telling them about his upcoming tour, about playing in Paris and Vienna and Tokyo. He dropped names of famous composers and conductors like they were his personal friends. Everything he said was designed to remind people how important he was, how far above them he stood. Lucas had moved closer now, drawn by the piano even though he knew he shouldn't be in the main room. He was trying to stay invisible, pressed against the wall near a tall plant. He just wanted to be near the instrument, to be close to something that created such beautiful sounds. His mother found him there and gave him a worried look. She knew that expression on her son's face. She had seen it before when he watched piano videos or read music books. It was hunger and longing and determination all mixed together. It scared her because she knew what the world did to people like them who wanted things they weren't supposed to want. "Lucas," she whispered, pulling at his arm. "Come back to the kitchen, please." But Lucas couldn't move. He was staring at the piano, at Victor standing beside it like he owned not just that instrument but all music everywhere. Something was building inside Lucas, something he couldn't quite name. It felt like anger and hope and fear all wrapped together. He didn't know it yet, but that feeling was about to push him toward a moment that would change everything. Sometimes the things we want most scare us the most, and sometimes being scared is exactly what we need to find our courage. The first note hung in the air like a question mark. It was a single G, played so softly that people had to stop talking to hear it. But there was something about that note, something in the way Lucas touched the key, that made it different from just any sound. It had feeling in it. Then came the second note and the third. The melody started to take shape, and suddenly the room went quiet. Not the planned, polite quiet of an audience ready to hear a performance. This was different. This was the shocked silence of people realizing they might have been wrong about something. Lucas was playing Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor. Anyone who knew classical piano knew this piece. It was considered one of the hardest compositions ever written, something that professional pianists spent months preparing to perform. It was the kind of piece that separated amateurs from masters, and this 17-year-old kid in cheap sneakers was playing it. The opening section of the ballad is deceptive. It starts gentle, almost questioning, like someone telling a story they're not sure anyone wants to hear. Lucas's fingers moved across the keys with a lightness that seemed impossible. Each note was clear, perfectly timed, but more than that, each note meant something. You could hear it in the way he shaped the phrases, the way he let some notes ring out and cut others short. Brittany Chen's smile had frozen on her face. Her phone was still recording, but now her hand was shaking slightly. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. This was supposed to be funny, something embarrassing to share with friends. But there was nothing funny about what she was hearing. Victor Ashford's arms had slowly uncrossed. He took a step closer to the piano, his head tilting slightly to one side. His expression was changing, the smug confidence draining away like water from a cracked glass. He was hearing what everyone else was hearing, but he understood it on a different level. He knew exactly how difficult this piece was. He had played it himself dozens of times. The ballade began to build. Lucas moved into the faster sections, his fingers dancing across the keys with increasing speed and confidence. The piece demanded enormous technical skill, rapid runs up and down the keyboard, complex chord progressions, jumps that required perfect accuracy. Miss one note and the whole thing would fall apart. It was like walking a tightrope without a net. Lucas didn't miss a single note. His hands were a blur now, moving with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone who had learned from videos and library books. But it wasn't just the technical skill that stunned the room. It was the emotion. Lucas wasn't just playing the notes that Chopin had written. He was telling a story with them, pulling something from deep inside himself and pouring it into the music. Every struggle he'd faced, every time someone had made him feel small or invisible, every night he'd practiced until his fingers ached, it was all there in the music. The ballade has sections that feel like anger, like defiance, like asking, "Why not me?" And Lucas played those sections with a fire that made people forget to breathe. Maria had both hands over her mouth now, tears streaming down her face. She recognized some of the emotion in the music because she had lived it too, the struggle of never having enough, of working hard and still being treated like you were less than other people, the hope that maybe somehow things could be different. It was her story and her son's story, and now everyone in this room was hearing it whether they wanted to or not. Mrs. Thornwood had sunk into a chair, one hand on her chest. Her carefully planned evening had spun completely out of her control, but she found she didn't care. She was watching something extraordinary, something she would talk about for the rest of her life. The piece moved through its various sections, the aggressive passages where Lucas's whole body moved with the music, the gentle parts where single notes hung in the air like tears, the building tension that made you feel like something was about to break or break through. The ballade is like a journey, starting with a question and moving toward an answer, and Lucas was taking everyone in that room on the journey with him. An older gentleman near the back of the crowd quietly pulled out his phone, not to mock, but to record. His name was Richard Winters, and he was a music critic for a major newspaper. He had come to the party as a favor to Mrs. Thornwood, expecting to be bored. He had heard Victor Ashford play before and found him technically perfect, but emotionally cold. But this was something else entirely. This was the kind of raw talent that came along maybe once in a generation. Lucas's eyes were closed now. He had forgotten about the audience, forgotten about Victor and Brittany and everyone who had laughed at him. He was somewhere else, somewhere where there was only the music and the feeling behind it. His fingers knew where to go without him having to think about it. Hours and hours of practice had trained his muscles to move the right way, to hit the right keys with the right pressure. But muscle memory alone couldn't create what the room was hearing. That came from somewhere deeper. Some place inside Lucas that he usually kept hidden because the world didn't seem interested in what he had to offer. But the piano was interested. The piano was listening. And through the piano, everyone else was finally listening too. The ballade was approaching its most difficult section, a series of rapid octaves that required enormous strength and control. Professional pianists had been known to stumble here, to let the piece get away from them. The room held its collective breath, waiting to see if this was where Lucas would finally fail, where reality would catch up with the dream. Lucas's hands came down on the keys with perfect precision. The octaves rang out, powerful and clear, each one hitting exactly where it should. His wrists absorbed the impact, his arms moved in smooth arcs. It was like watching an athlete at the peak of their performance, when skill and instinct merge into something that looks effortless even though you know it's not. Someone in the crowd gasped. Then another person. The sound of the piano filled every corner of the ballroom, bouncing off the high ceiling, making the crystal chandeliers vibrate slightly with the resonance. It was the kind of sound that you don't just hear. You feel it in your chest, in your bones. Victor Ashford's face had gone pale. He was watching Lucas's hands move across the keyboard, seeing the technique that should have taken years of expensive lessons to develop. But more than that, he was hearing something he rarely heard in his own playing anymore. Heart. Truth. Music that came from necessity rather than obligation. The piece was building to its climax now, getting louder and more intense with each measure. Lucas's body was moving with the music, swaying slightly, his face showing the emotion of what he was playing. He looked like he was wrestling with something, fighting for something, and winning. And then, after several minutes that felt like seconds and hours at the same time, Lucas played the final notes. The ending of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 is powerful, but also somehow uncertain, like a question that's been answered but leaves room for more questions. Lucas held the final chord, letting it ring out until the last vibration faded into silence. His hand stayed on the keys for a moment longer. Then he lifted them slowly and placed them in his lap. He opened his eyes and for the first time since he started playing, remembered where he was. He turned slightly on the bench to look at the crowd. Nobody was laughing anymore. The silence that filled the ballroom after Lucas finished playing was thick and heavy. It was the kind of silence that happens when people's brains need a moment to catch up with what their ears just heard. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed or shifted in their seats. Even the waiters standing along the walls had frozen mid-step, their trays of champagne forgotten. Lucas sat on the piano bench, his hands trembling slightly now that the music had stopped. He was suddenly aware of how fast his heart was beating, how his shirt was sticking to his back with sweat. Playing that piece had taken everything he had. He felt empty and full at the same time, scared and brave, small and somehow bigger than he'd ever been. He looked out at the crowd, trying to read their faces. Some people had their mouths hanging slightly open. Others had this distant look in their eyes like they were still processing what they'd just witnessed. Brittany Chen was standing completely still, her phone dangling from her hand, the cruel smile long gone from her face. Then from somewhere in the back of the room, someone started clapping. It was Richard Winters, the music critic. He wasn't doing the polite little golf claps that rich people do at fancy events. He was really clapping, his hands coming together hard and loud. And he was standing up. The sound seemed to break the spell over everyone else. Suddenly, the entire room erupted. People jumped to their feet, applauding so loudly it was almost like thunder. Some people were shouting. Others were wiping their eyes with napkins. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, and Lucas just sat there taking it in, not quite believing it was real. Maria was crying openly now, not even trying to hide it. Another maid standing near her squeezed her shoulder, and Maria grabbed her hand and held on tight. She was watching her son, her boy who used to practice on that cheap little keyboard with broken keys, receiving a standing ovation from people who 5 minutes ago had been laughing at him. Mrs. Thornwood was on her feet too, her hands pressed to her cheeks. She looked shocked, delighted, and a little bit embarrassed all at once. She was probably thinking about how close she had come to throwing Lucas out before he could play, how she had almost sided with the mockers instead of giving him a chance. But the most interesting reaction was Victor Ashford's. The famous pianist was still standing where he'd been when Lucas started playing, just a few feet from the piano. His face was going through so many emotions it was like watching a movie in fast forward. Shock, disbelief, anger, and then something else. Something that might have been respect or recognition, or maybe just the honest acknowledgement that he'd been wrong. Victor stood there while the applause continued, his hands at his sides, not clapping. He was staring at Lucas like he was seeing him for the first time, or maybe like he was seeing himself for the first time, reflected back in this teenage boy who had more passion in his playing than Victor had allowed himself to show in years. The applause went on and on. Lucas finally stood up from the bench, his legs feeling shaky. He didn't know what to do. Should he bow, wave? He had never been in front of people like this before. At school talent shows, sure, but this was different. These were adults, important people, and they were clapping for him. A man in an expensive suit pushed through the crowd. It was Robert Chen, Brittany's father. He reached Lucas and grabbed his hand, shaking it enthusiastically. "That was incredible," he said, his voice loud to be heard over the continuing applause. "Absolutely incredible. Where did you study?" Before Lucas could answer, more people were surrounding him, all talking at once. They wanted to know who his teacher was, where he went to school, how long he'd been playing. Their faces were so different now, interested, impressed, friendly. The same people who had been ready to laugh at his failure were now fighting to talk to him, to be associated with his success. Lucas tried to answer their questions, but his mouth felt dry and his thoughts were jumbled. Everything was happening so fast. A woman in a blue dress was asking if he had an agent. A man with gray hair wanted to know if he'd ever played in competitions. Someone else was asking about his musical background, his family, his plans for the future. Through the crowd, Lucas could see his mother. Maria was trying to get to him, pushing politely through the well-dressed bodies. When she finally reached him, she wrapped her arms around him tight, not caring who saw or what they thought. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered in his ear. So proud. The applause was finally dying down, but the energy in the room was still electric. People were talking excitedly to each other, reliving what they'd just heard. Several phones had recorded the performance, and already some guests were replaying the videos, watching Lucas's hands move across the keys, hearing that beautiful sound again. Brittany Chen stood off to the side, looking uncomfortable. Her friends around her didn't know what to say. The joke had backfired in the worst possible way. Instead of embarrassing the help's son, they had given him a platform to show everyone how wrong they were. Brittany's face was red, and she kept looking at her phone at the video she had recorded, meaning to mock him. Now that video showed her own misjudgment, captured forever, and then Victor Ashford started walking toward Lucas. The crowd parted for him automatically, the way people do for someone famous. Conversations quieted down as everyone watched to see what would happen. Victor had a strange expression on his face, serious, thoughtful, maybe a little sad. When he reached Lucas, he stopped and stood there for a moment, just looking at the younger man. Lucas felt his stomach tighten. He had just played on Victor's stage, stolen his spotlight, done the one thing that might make the famous pianist angry, and Victor had power here. One word from him could turn this whole thing around, could make Lucas look foolish again. But Victor did something unexpected. He extended his hand. "That," Victor said quietly, loud enough for nearby people to hear but not shouting, was one of the most remarkable performances I've ever witnessed. His voice was different now, the smooth, practice tone was gone, replaced with something more real. "Your interpretation of the ballade. It had something my playing often lacks." Lucas stared at the offered hand for a second, then reached out and shook it. Victor's grip was firm, and he held on for a moment longer than a normal handshake. "I owe you an apology," Victor continued, and now the whole room was definitely listening. The famous pianist was apologizing to the Maid's son. This was almost as surprising as the performance itself. "I said some things tonight about who belongs in music, about breeding and training. You've just proved me wrong, completely wrong." Victor's voice got quieter, and Lucas had to lean in to hear him clearly. "You have a gift," Victor said. "A real, genuine gift, and I almost helped destroy it before anyone heard it." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "That's what I've become. Someone who tears down instead of building up. Someone who forgot why I fell in love with music in the first place." Lucas didn't know what to say. He just nodded, feeling overwhelmed by everything. The performance, the applause, and now this moment with someone he had admired and feared at the same time. The crowd was pressing closer now, everyone wanting to be part of this moment. Mrs. Thornwood appeared at Victor's side, her face glowing. Richard Winters, the critic, had his notebook out and was scribbling rapidly. Other guests were still recording on their phones, capturing every second. But in the middle of all this attention and noise and excitement, Lucas looked past everyone and found his mother's face in the crowd. Maria was smiling through her tears, one hand over her heart. She gave him a small nod, and somehow that meant more than all the applause and handshakes combined. Everything had changed in the space of one performance. Lucas had walked into this ballroom as invisible help, someone to be ignored or mocked. He was leaving as someone people would remember, someone who had proven that talent doesn't care about your address or your bank account. It comes from somewhere deeper, somewhere that fancy lessons and expensive schools can't touch. The night was far from over, but for Lucas, standing there in his worn sneakers with his mother's proud smile shining at him through the crowd, this was already the most important moment of his life. After Victor's apology, the crowd around Lucas was buzzing with questions and excitement. But Victor held up his hand asking for quiet. The room settled down, curious about what the famous pianist would say next. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor said, his voice carrying across the ballroom. "I've been playing piano professionally for 30 years. I've performed in the greatest concert halls in the world. And tonight I witnessed something I rarely see. Pure, unfiltered talent meeting genuine passion." He turned to Lucas. "Would you honor us with another piece?" The request hung in the air. Lucas felt his heart jump into his throat. Play again? He had barely recovered from the first performance. His hands were still shaking, his mind still reeling from everything that had just happened. But he looked at the piano still sitting there waiting, and he felt that pull again, that need to play to let the music out. "I'd be honored," Lucas heard himself say. The crowd erupted in applause again, people settling back into their spots, pulling up chairs to get closer. Mrs. Thornwood was beaming now, realizing that her party had transformed from a predictable social event into something people would talk about for years. She gestured to the waiters to bring more champagne, to keep everyone comfortable while they watched. Lucas walked back to the piano bench and sat down. This time felt different. The first time, he'd been driven by a mixture of defiance and desperation, proving something to himself and everyone else. Now he could just play, just share the music he loved with people who wanted to hear it. He thought for a moment about what to play next. His mind scrolled through all the pieces he knew, all the hours he'd spent with his cheap keyboard. Then he decided on Debussy's Clair de Lune, Moonlight. It was a piece that everyone recognized, but few people realized how difficult it was to play well. It required a delicate touch, a sense of timing that was almost like breathing. Lucas placed his hands on the keys and began. The opening notes of Clair de Lune are soft and dreamy, like watching moonlight dance on water. Lucas played them with such gentleness that people automatically leaned forward, afraid to miss a single sound. The piece flowed from his fingers like liquid silver, each note perfectly placed but also somehow spontaneous, as if he was creating the music in that exact moment rather than playing something written over 100 years ago. Victor had moved to sit in one of the chairs, and he was watching Lucas's technique closely. He noticed things that others might miss. The way Lucas used the pedals to blend notes together, how he shaped each phrase with tiny changes in volume and tempo, the way his body moved with the music without being dramatic about it. These were things that usually took years of lessons to learn, yet here was this self-taught kid doing them naturally. Maria had found a spot against the wall where she could watch her son without being in the way. She was crying again, but these were different tears, happy tears, proud tears. She thought about all the times she'd worried about Lucas, wondered if his obsession with music was practical, if she should push him towards something more stable. Now she understood. This was who he was supposed to be. This was his purpose, clear as daylight. Richard Winters, the music critic, was still taking notes, but his hand moved slowly. He kept stopping to just listen, to let the music wash over him. In his career, he'd heard thousands of performances. He'd reviewed famous pianists, promising young talents, established masters. But there was something about Lucas that was different. Maybe it was the hunger in his playing, the sense that every note mattered because he'd had to fight so hard just to get the chance to play them. The piece moved through its various sections, the gentle opening, the slightly more urgent middle part where the music swells with emotion, then back to the peaceful ending. Lucas played it all with a maturity that seemed impossible for someone so young. He understood that the piece was about more than just moonlight. It was about longing, about beauty that exists even in darkness, about holding on to something precious even when everything around you is uncertain. When he finished, the silence lasted even longer than before. Clair de Lune ends so softly that you're not quite sure when it's actually over. The last notes fade away like morning mist, and Lucas held his hands above the keys for a moment, letting the final vibrations die away completely before lowering them. Then the applause came again, even louder than before. People were on their feet instantly, some wiping their eyes, others turning to their neighbors to share their amazement. A woman near the front was openly sobbing. A man next to her just kept shaking his head in disbelief. "More!" someone shouted from the back. "Please play more." Others joined in, calling for another piece. Lucas looked overwhelmed, glancing at his mother as if asking for permission. Maria smiled and nodded. How could she say no? This was his moment, his night. Let him have it. Lucas played 5 more pieces that evening. He played Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, which made people feel things they'd forgotten they could feel. He played some jazz, a piece by Bill Evans that showed he wasn't just a classical player. He played a modern piece that most people didn't recognize, something he'd discovered on YouTube and fallen in love with. With each performance, the crowd grew more entranced. People who had been standing sat down to listen more comfortably. Guests who had planned to leave early stayed, unwilling to miss what might come next. Even the catering staff had stopped working and were watching from the doorways, their own tasks forgotten. Between pieces, people would talk quietly, sharing their reactions. "How is this possible?" one woman asked. "He taught himself." Another replied, still sounding shocked. "There's no way," a man insisted. He must have had training somewhere. But the truth was exactly what it seemed. Lucas had learned from videos and books and sheer determination. He had spent thousands of hours on that little keyboard, practicing until his fingers cramped, replaying sections over and over until he got them right. What people were calling impossible was really just the result of obsession, combined with natural talent and a refusal to give up. Victor sat through all of it, watching Lucas with an expression that was hard to read. There was admiration there, definitely, but also something else. Envy maybe, or regret. He was seeing everything he could have been if he hadn't let success and money and ego get in the way of the music itself. Lucas played like someone who loved every single note. Victor had forgotten when he'd last felt that way. After the 6th piece, Lucas was clearly exhausted. His face was flushed, his shirt soaked with sweat. Playing that intensely for that long took enormous physical energy. Not to mention emotional strength. Mrs. Thornwood noticed and stepped forward. "Perhaps we should let our remarkable young pianist rest," she announced to the crowd, which responded with understanding applause. She turned to Lucas. "Thank you, dear boy. You've made this an evening none of us will ever forget." Lucas stood up from the bench on shaky legs. He felt like he'd run a marathon. His fingers were sore, his back ached from sitting, his head was spinning with everything that had happened. But inside he felt something he'd never quite felt before, complete, like he'd found the thing he was supposed to do with his life and had proven to himself more than anyone that he could do. It. As he stepped down from the platform, people crowded around him again. But this time Maria was ready. She pushed through the crowd and took her son's arm protectively. "Excuse us, please," she said firmly. "He needs some air." People stepped back, respecting her request. Mother and son walked toward a set of French doors that led to a balcony overlooking the garden. When they stepped outside into the cool night air, Lucas took a deep breath and felt some of the tension drain from his body. That was, he started, but couldn't finish. There weren't words for what had just happened. "I know," Maria said, putting her arm around him. "I know, sweetheart." They stood there for a moment, just breathing, letting the quiet of the garden wash over them after the noise and intensity of the ballroom. Through the glass doors, they could see the party continuing, people talking animatedly, probably still discussing what they'd witnessed. But the night wasn't over yet. Inside the ballroom, Richard Winters was pulling out his business card, planning what he would write in tomorrow's paper. Victor Ashford was talking quietly with Mrs. Thornwood about something important. And several other people were making phone calls, reaching out to contacts, setting in motion events that would change Lucas's life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Sometimes everything changes in a single night. Sometimes one chance, one moment of courage opens doors you didn't even know existed. Lucas had walked into Thornwood Manor as nobody special. He was about to leave as someone the world wouldn't forget. Lucas and Maria only had a few minutes alone on the balcony before the French doors opened behind them. They turned to see Richard Winters, the music critic, stepping outside. He held a business card between his fingers and had a warm smile on his face. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said gently. "I'm Richard Winters. I write about music for the National Chronicle." He extended the card to Lucas. "That was the most extraordinary performance I've witnessed in my 20 years of covering music." Lucas took the card with trembling fingers. The National Chronicle was one of the biggest newspapers in the country. His mother squeezed his shoulder, her eyes wide. "Thank you, sir," Lucas managed to say. "I recorded your first piece. I hope you don't mind." Richard continued. "I'd like to write about what happened here tonight. But more than that, I'd like your permission to share that recording. The world needs to hear what you can do." Before Lucas could respond, Mrs. Thornwood appeared at the doorway with Victor Ashford beside her. They both looked serious, but in a good way, like people making important plans. "Lucas, dear," Mrs. Thornwood said, "could you and your mother come back inside for a moment? There are some people who'd like to speak with you." Back in the ballroom, a small group had gathered near the piano. Lucas recognized some faces from earlier, the woman in the blue dress, the man with gray hair. But there were new faces too, people who looked official and important. A woman in a sharp black suit stepped forward first. "My name is Dr. Patricia Morrison," she said, offering her hand. "I'm the Dean of Admissions at the Berkshire Conservatory of Music. I happen to be here tonight as a guest." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "Lucas, I want to offer you a full audition for our program. Based on what I heard tonight, I have no doubt you would be accepted." Lucas felt his knees go weak. Berkshire Conservatory was one of the top music schools in the country. Students there went on to play with major orchestras, to tour the world, to have real careers in music. But Dr. Morrison wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I'd like to recommend you for our premier scholarship program. Full tuition, room and board, and a living stipend. Everything covered," Maria gasped beside him. Lucas couldn't speak. Full scholarship? Everything covered? This was the kind of thing he'd dreamed about but never really believed could happen to someone like him. Another man stepped forward. "I'm David Chen," he said, and Lucas recognized him. It was Brittany's father. "I want to apologize for my daughter's behavior earlier. It was unacceptable." He glanced back at Brittany, who stood nearby looking uncomfortable. She stepped forward reluctantly. "I'm sorry," Brittany said quietly, not quite meeting Lucas's eyes. "That was wrong. What I did, I shouldn't have." "You were amazing." The words seemed hard for her to say, but she said them anyway. Lucas nodded, accepting the apology. He wasn't the kind of person who held grudges. Besides, everything had worked out better than he ever could have imagined. David Chen continued. "I own Chen Properties. We develop buildings all over the city. I'd like to fund an additional scholarship in your name for other young people who have talent but not opportunity. And I'd like to sponsor your performances while you're studying. Make sure you have access to the best instruments and venues." More people came forward. A representative from a major music foundation offered to provide Lucas with a professional-grade piano for practice. A concert promoter talked about wanting to book him for small performances once he'd had some formal training. A piano manufacturer offered to sponsor him, providing instruments and support. It was overwhelming. Lucas's head was spinning trying to process it all. These were opportunities that professional musicians spent years working toward, and they were being offered to him all at once. But the most meaningful moment came when Victor Ashford stepped forward. "Lucas," the famous pianist said, and his voice was different than it had been all evening. Humble, genuine. "I've been thinking about what happened tonight, about what I said, how I acted, who I've become." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "I'd like to offer you something if you're interested. Private lessons. Once a week, no charge. I can't teach you passion. You already have more of that than I've felt in years. But I can teach you technique, help you refine what you already have. I can open doors, introduce you to the right people." He looked at Maria. "I know you've sacrificed everything for your son. I can see it in how he plays, that hunger, that determination, that came from you teaching him that dreams are worth fighting for." I want to help if you'll let me. Maria's hand was over her mouth, tears streaming down her face again. She couldn't speak, so she just nodded. Victor turned back to Lucas. But I want you to promise me something, he said seriously. Don't become what I became. Don't let success make you forget where you came from or why you play. Don't ever look at someone the way I looked at you tonight and decide they're not worthy before giving them a chance. I promise, Lucas said. And he meant it. The next hour was a blur of conversations and business cards and promises. Mrs. Thornwood announced that she was setting up a fund for Maria, enough that she wouldn't have to work as a maid anymore if she didn't want to. I'm offering you a position as my personal assistant, Mrs. Thornwood told Maria. Better hours, better pay, and you'll have time to support Lucas's education. I've seen your work ethic all these years. It's time I properly valued it. Richard Winters was busy typing on his laptop, working on his article. Every few minutes he'd look up at Lucas with a smile and shake his head in wonder. This story writes itself, he said. Young man overcomes poverty and prejudice through pure talent. It's going to be front page. Your life is about to change in ways you can't imagine. He was right about that. Even as they spoke, the videos that guests had recorded were starting to appear online. Brittany's recording, originally meant to mock, had been uploaded with a caption. This is what real talent looks like. I almost missed it because of my own prejudice. Listen to this amazing young pianist. It was getting thousands of views, shares multiplying by the minute. People were tagging friends, music teachers, news outlets. The hashtag Piano Boy was starting to trend. Comments poured in from around the world, from other musicians, from music lovers, from people who connected with the story of someone being underestimated and then proving everyone wrong. By the time Lucas and Maria left Thornwood Manor that night, Lucas's phone, his mother's old phone that he'd learned piano from, had hundreds of notifications. Friend requests, messages from strangers, interview requests from radio stations and podcasts. The local news wanted to do a story. A morning show producer was asking if he'd come on air. They walked to the bus stop like they always did, but everything felt different now. Maria kept looking at her son like she was seeing him for the first time. Lucas kept looking at his hands, the same hands that had worked a cheap keyboard for years, hardly believing what they'd accomplished tonight. What happens now? Lucas asked as they waited for the bus. Maria hugged him tight. Now, sweetheart, you get to become who you were always meant to be. We both do. The bus came and they rode home to their small apartment, but they both knew they were leaving more than Thornwood Manor behind. They were leaving behind the old life, the old limitations, the old ideas about what was possible. Tomorrow, Richard Winters' article would appear in the National Chronicle. Within days, it would be picked up by other papers, by online news sites, by television programs. The video of Lucas playing would go viral, reaching millions of people around the world. Music schools would compete to have him. Agents would call offering representation. But tonight, in the quiet of the bus ride home, it was just a mother and her son, holding hands and trying to process how one moment of courage had changed everything. Lucas looked out the window at the city lights passing by, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he could see the path ahead clearly. It was a path that led through prestigious schools and concert halls, through hard work and dedication, through challenges and triumphs. But it was his path now, finally open to him after years of dreaming it might be. All because he'd been brave enough to play one piece of music in front of people who didn't think he could. All because he'd refused to accept their judgment of who he was supposed to be. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change your life. One moment of courage. One chance to show the world what you're capable of. One note that proves you belong. 3 months had passed since that night at Thornwood Manor, and Lucas still sometimes had to pinch himself to believe everything was real. The morning after the party, he'd woken up to find his phone completely dead from all the notifications. When he charged it and turned it on, there were over 3,000 messages waiting. The video of him playing had been viewed more than 2 million times. Richard Winters' article in the National Chronicle had the headline, "From Maid's Son to Musical Sensation, the Story of Lucas Santos," and it had gone viral. By the end of that first week, Lucas had appeared on 3 morning television shows, done interviews with 12 radio stations, and been featured in music magazines he'd only dreamed of reading. People called him an inspiration. They called him a prodigy. They called him proof that talent could come from anywhere. But the real changes were more personal and more profound. His mother no longer cleaned rooms at Thornwood Manor. Mrs. Thornwood had been true to her word, hiring Maria as her personal assistant with a salary that was triple what she'd made as a maid. They'd moved out of their tiny apartment into a small house with an actual yard. Nothing fancy, but it was theirs, and it had a room that Lucas could use as a music studio. That room now contained a beautiful grand piano, donated by the manufacturer who'd offered to sponsor Lucas. Every morning, he'd wake up and go to that room, and for a moment he'd just stand in the doorway looking at it, still not quite believing it was real. The cheap little keyboard that had started everything sat on a shelf nearby, a reminder of where he'd come from. Victor Ashford had also kept his promise. Every Saturday, Lucas took the train into the city for a private lesson at Victor's studio. The famous pianist was a different person now, still demanding and precise but encouraging rather than cruel. He pushed Lucas to be better, to refine his technique, to understand the theory behind the music he'd been playing by instinct. "You have natural talent," Victor told him during one lesson. "But talent alone isn't enough for a real career. You need discipline, theory, endurance. You need to understand music not just with your heart but with your mind." Lucas soaked it all up like a sponge. He practiced 6 hours a day now, sometimes more. It wasn't work though, it was joy. Every day he got to spend doing what he loved felt like a gift. The acceptance letter from Juilliard had arrived 6 weeks after that night at Thornwood Manor. Lucas had applied to several schools, but Juilliard was the dream, the best music school in America, maybe in the world. When he opened the envelope and saw the word congratulations, he'd cried. Maria had cried. They'd held each other in the kitchen of their new house and cried happy tears. The full scholarship from Berkshire Conservatory was still on the table, and it was an incredible offer. But Juilliard had matched it, adding even more support. They wanted Lucas. They saw in him what Victor and Richard Winters and everyone at that party had seen. Something special. Something rare. Now on a warm September morning, Lucas stood outside the Juilliard building in New York City, a backpack over his shoulder and his old keyboard case in his hand. Inside the case wasn't the piano itself, that was too precious to risk damaging. But he'd brought it anyway, empty as a reminder. Other students were arriving too, most with their parents, many looking nervous and excited. Lucas was alone. His mother had wanted to come, but she had to work, and besides, Lucas had wanted to do this part by himself. This was his journey, his beginning. As he stood there looking up at the building, someone called his name. He turned to see a young woman about his age, her face excited. "You're Lucas Santos, right?" "Oh my God, I've watched your videos like 100 times. I'm Teresa, first-year piano major too. I can't believe I'm going to school with you." Lucas smiled, feeling a bit embarrassed but also grateful. "Nice to meet you, Teresa. Your Chopin interpretation is incredible," she continued enthusiastically. "The way you handle the octave passages in the ballade? I've been trying to learn from that. My teacher said your feeling for the music is something that can't be taught." Other students were gathering now, recognizing Lucas, introducing themselves. Some had seen the videos. Others had read the articles. A few had been at the party that night, children of wealthy families who attended Juilliard. But here in this place, none of that mattered. Rich or poor, everyone was a student. Everyone was here to learn and grow. Inside the building, Lucas found his way to his first class, Advanced Piano Technique. The instructor was a stern-looking woman named Professor Chen, who had performed with major orchestras around the world before retiring to teach. She looked at her class of 12 students, her eyes lingering on Lucas for a moment before moving on. "Welcome to Juilliard," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "You're all here because you're talented. But talent is common. This school is full of talented people. What separates those who make it from those who don't is dedication, discipline, and the willingness to accept that no matter how good you are, you can always be better." She looked at Lucas again. "Some of you come here with years of expensive training. Some of you are self-taught. I don't care about your background. I care about what you can do today, and what you're willing to do to be better tomorrow. Is that understood?" Everyone nodded. The class began, and Lucas realized quickly that he had a lot to learn. His technique was good, but there were gaps in his knowledge. Things that formally trained students had learned years ago that he'd never encountered. Professor Chen noticed these gaps and addressed them, but not with cruelty, with teaching. During a break, a student named David approached Lucas. He was tall, confident, and came from a family of classical musicians. "Hey," he said, offering his hand. "That video of you at the Thornwood party was amazing, but you've got some technical issues with your left-hand positioning. I noticed it in class. Want to practice together sometime? Maybe we can help each other out." This was what Lucas loved most about Juilliard so far. Nobody was trying to tear anyone else down. Everyone was focused on getting better, helping each other improve. It was competition, sure, but healthy competition, the kind that made everyone stronger. After his classes that day, Lucas found a practice room, a small space with a piano and soundproof walls. He sat down and just played for an hour, not working on anything specific, just feeling the music. Through the walls, he could hear other students practicing. Someone was playing Bach, someone else was doing scales. The building hummed with music, with dedication, with dreams being pursued. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "How's the first day? I'm thinking about you. So proud of you, sweetheart." He texted back. "It's perfect, Mom. Thank you for everything." Another text came through, this time from Victor. "Remember, perfect practice makes perfect. Sloppy practice just makes you good at being sloppy. Show them what you're made of," Lucas smiled. 3 months ago, Victor had been his critic. Now he was his mentor and, surprisingly, something like a friend. That evening, Lucas walked through the campus as the sun set. Students were everywhere, practicing, studying, talking about music and art and performance. He'd found his people, his tribe. The ones who understood that music wasn't just something you did, it was something you were. He thought about Brittany Chen, who'd tried to humiliate him. Her video had ended up being the thing that launched his career, shared millions of times with her apology attached. She'd learned something that night too, about judgment, about giving people chances, about how wrong you can be when you decide someone isn't worthy without really seeing them. He thought about all the people at that party who'd laughed at him, who'd pulled out their phones expecting to capture his failure. Instead, they'd captured the moment everything changed. Sometimes the people who try to tear you down end up being the ones who lift you up, just not in the way they intended. Most of all, he thought about his mother, Maria, who'd cleaned houses for years so he could have that cheap keyboard, who'd supported his dreams even when they seemed impossible, who'd never once told him to be more realistic or aim lower. She'd believed in him when nobody else did, when even he didn't fully believe in himself. Everything he did from now on, every performance, every achievement, it would be for her as much as for himself. To prove that her sacrifice meant something. To show her that betting on her son's dream had been the right choice. Lucas walked back to his dorm room as the sky turned dark and the city lights came on. Tomorrow he'd practice for 6 hours. He'd attend classes, work on technique, study theory. He'd keep improving, keep growing, keep reaching for something even higher. But tonight, on his first day at Juilliard, he just wanted to sit with the feeling of having made it here, of having turned that one moment of courage at Thornwood Manor into the beginning of a real life, a real career, a real chance to become everything he'd dreamed of being. He pulled out his phone and opened YouTube, finding the video of that night. 3 months later, and it still had comments rolling in. People from all over the world saying he'd inspired them to pursue their dreams, to not give up, to believe that where you start doesn't have to be where you end up. One comment caught his eye. Posted just an hour ago. "I'm a 14-year-old kid who loves piano, but my family can't afford lessons. Watching this video makes me believe